Hey everybody, this video is going to go over the PowerPoint in the week 3 module on opposition, right? So this whole class that we're working on here on rhetorical persuasion, we are learning about how to analyze and create our own arguments. And we're learning a lot about how to make sure our own argument has a focused claim, is well supported, that we haven't committed any logical fallacies. We've kind of been focused on our own argument, our own claim, right? But argument is not a monologue. You are not alone. Even if you're writing an essay, you should still be thinking about a wider audience, not just the instructor, and even not just your classmates, because there's other students in other classes in other schools in other cities in other states that have different experiences than you and your classmates in your class in your school. And you still want to assume that wider audience, that theoretical audience, if you will. And not everyone is going to agree with you, right? So not only do you have to have a debatable claim that someone can argue with, that there's going to be people out there who have a different point of view, you have to consider the opposition. You have to consider their point of view. Good argument does not ignore the opposition. It will directly engage opposing ideas and enter into a larger conversation about the topic. We're going to be looking at 3 ways in particular that you can consider the opposition: counter-argument, concession, and qualifiers, right? So counter-argument is where you address one of those opposing viewpoints and directly refute it in your argument. Okay, you can use counter-argument to explain how that opposing viewpoint is somehow wrong. And if you can do that, then you are strengthening your own claim, right? If you can say, the opposition is going to say this, there's going to be people out there who disagree with me and they're going to have this to say about it, but let me tell you why that's wrong. That's only strengthening your own argument, right? For counter argument to work, you have to anticipate what the opposition is going to say. You have to anticipate their logic. You have to understand their point of view almost as well as they do, almost as well as you understand your own point of view. A solid argument obviously has to strongly support your own claim, but it also has to anticipate and argue against the opposition. Okay? So on the next slide, there's an example here. So the Center for Applied Business argues that American corporations need to take their operations overseas because in the United States it is too expensive. However, this is just silly. Americans should be paid well because they do a great job. Okay, so in this example, the author does mention the opposing viewpoint, but does he really address it? Actually, he falls victim to the personal response problem. He just ridicules the opposing viewpoint. That's just silly, right? If you're going to engage the opposition and mention the opposition, you have to fully address their view, their stance, and explain why it's wrong or misguided. You can't just say that's silly. That's just an attack if you really think about it. That's not really explaining how or why it's wrong. If it's silly, why is it silly? But don't say it's silly. That's just an attack, and it's going to make you seem like a not so nice person. So here we have a better example on the next slide. I know that some people say the idea of a law of nature or decent behavior known to all men is unsound because different civilizations and different ages have had quite different moralities. But this is not true. There have been differences between their moralities, but these have never amounted to anything like a total difference. If anyone will take the trouble to compare the moral teaching of, say, the ancient Egyptians, Babylonians, Hindus, Chinese, Greek, and Romans, what will really strike them will be how very like they are to each other and to our own. So this addresses the opposing viewpoint, right? That this idea of a law of nature or this idea of decent behavior known to all men is wrong. Like there's no basis for it. Um, he mentions that opposing view, but he doesn't just move right on. He takes the time to explain that point of view and then explain how it's flawed. That is addressing the opposition appropriately, addressing the opposition in a way that shows respect, but also strengthens your own argument. Okay? So remember, strong argument will always consider and address the opposition, but you can't just mention the opposition as a way to ridicule or deride them. Do not fall victim to the personal response problem. Sometimes you can briefly mention the opposition. Other times you might have to explain their opposing viewpoint in more detail. But always use the opportunity to explain why that view is flawed and why yours is better, right? Start thinking about the opposition from the very beginning. Not only will it ensure you have a strong argument, but understanding the opposing points of view will help you clarify your own better. If you can really get into what the opposing viewpoints are and you're picking them apart and saying, this is why they're wrong, this is why it's flawed, this is why mine is better, you come to a better understanding of your own claim. Then including it in the argument itself just strengthens your claim in the eyes of the audience. So you want to consider the opposition in your discovery process, in your invention process from the very beginning. When you come up with your topic and you think of your claim, you want to immediately start thinking about what others say about this issue and start thinking about why they say it. Why do they feel that way? Why do they think that way? It will help you clarify your own stance. And then when you get into the argument, actually writing the essay, you bring in those opposing point of views and it strengthens your argument in the reader's eyes. So it's tantamount to success. You have to consider the opposition, right? Another way that we can consider the opposition is through what we call concession. So counter argument is anticipating their opposing claim and showing how it's flawed and why yours is better. Concession is actually going to point out when the opposition has a valid point, when it has merit. Now that might seem counterproductive. Why would you want to admit that the opposition makes a good point? But by admitting that they have a valid claim, you appear more reasonable and your audience will trust you more. You're not just going on some rant. You are reasonable enough and you have strong enough critical thinking skills that you can recognize when the opposition makes a valid claim. That's not going to weaken your argument as long as your argument is strong. It's basically saying, yeah, they make a good point, but I'm still right, and here's why. So concession does not mean you're giving up. It does not mean that you are admitting that the opposition has a better argument than you. You're just being reasonable. You're pointing out that, yes, they make a valid claim, but yours is still stronger, and here's why. Okay. Here's some examples of using concession. I agree with you that people should be able to figure some things out. Some people will be able to figure out more than others, and some people will be able to figure out very little. So in this example, the author is writing a letter to Kohl's, criticizing how they push their credit cards, their Kohl's cards, when you are checking out. And he's basically saying that the sales people, the cashiers, they do not reveal all the information. They're not forthcoming with all the details of it. And that it's kind of sneaky, if not downright wrong. And, he is writing this letter to criticize them and say, you guys should really change your policy. You should really change how you try to get people to sign up for this credit card. Because there's a lot of people who aren't going to understand the finer points. They're not going to be aware of how all of this works, and it's going to get them in trouble, and you know it. But he's saying, I agree I know you're going to say, well, they're all adults. They should, you have to be an adult to get it. You should be able to figure this, they should be able to figure it out. They should know, right? Or take it upon themselves to ask questions first. And he's like, I agree. Some people should be able to figure some things out. But let's be honest, some people are going to be able to figure out more than others, and there's going to be a big group of people out there who really don't understand very much of this at all, and you're taking advantage of them. So he concedes the one point, but then builds on it to strengthen his own point, right? Another example. Of course, Kohl's employees cannot spell out every detail of the situation, but they should not take any action to purposefully deceive. Society has a responsibility to educate people enough so that they can figure things out on their own, and influential executives such as you have a responsibility to not purposefully deceive the public. So again, he's conceding the one point that, we should be more aware, but he uses that then to make his own point stronger that, if we have a responsibility to do this, then you have a responsibility to not do that, right? So it's okay to concede a point to the opposition. It's okay to say they make a good point here, right? It makes sense. I understand where they're coming from. However, here's where that is still flawed. Here's where my argument is still stronger, right? The third way that we can consider the opposition is through what we call qualifiers. They're closely related to concessions in that you're giving a little bit, you're giving in a little bit, the give and take of an argument, you're giving a little with the concession. The qualifier, though, is more about giving a little in terms of your own argument, your own claim. A qualifier takes your claim from the land of absolutes to the land of probability. And that's a good thing, because you don't want your claim to come off sounding so strict, so close-minded, and so narrow that there's no room for possibilities of anything else, right? So notice the difference here. Politicians are liars. That's very narrow, very straight down that line, right? Very rigid. Compare that to, I'm not saying all politicians are bad, but many of them seem to distort the truth. Now, that is a claim that people would be more willing to listen to consider, right? But when you just say politicians are liars, your audience is going to think, well, this person's already convinced, and they are not reasonable, and they will not even consider that they could be wrong in some instances. The second example, though, that shows you're reasonable, and it shows you understand that your claim that most politicians are liars, but not all of them. It makes you more reasonable. Or teenagers are horrible drivers, right? You're basically saying every single teenager out there with a license behind the wheel is a horrible driver. And if you really feel that way, then you're going to have a hard time convincing your readers to fully agree with you. But if you say, when they're distracted by cell phones and stereos, even the most attentive teenager can become a rotten driver, then your audience is going to say, oh, well, we're not talking about every teenager every time they're behind the wheel. We're talking about most teenagers and in very specific circumstances. That seems more reasonable. I'm willing to listen, right? So a lot of, in the book, there's a list of all different types of qualifying words and qualifying phrases that we use. But it's basically, instead of saying all, it's many or most. None, few, right? Never, rarely. Always is often, right? So you allow for the possibility that your claim is not always 100% true 100% of the time. And that might seem like you're backing down, but you're not. Again, It's making yourself seem reasonable, and it will allow the audience to give you a chance, right? Because you're not being so rigid. It's a good thing. So counter argument, concessions, and qualifiers, they're all good things. You need to consider the opposition from the very beginning of your process, and then you need to include the opposition in the actual argument. We do that with the counter arguments, anticipating their points and explaining them if necessary, and then showing how they're flawed and how your point is stronger. We do it through concession, pointing out when they make a good point, when they have a valid claim, but then showing how it's still flawed and how your argument is still stronger. And then we use the qualifiers to show that we understand our claim. While we believe it and we are passionate about it, we understand that it's not true 100% of the time in 100% of situations. So considering the opposition does not weaken your argument, it only makes it stronger. But don't forget, at the end of the day, though, this is your argument, so you still want to remain strong and confident in your claim. You are so confident in your claim that you are willing to invite in the opposition and deal directly with the opposition, meet them head on in your argument, and show how, despite how valid they might be in some cases, your argument is still stronger. Your claim is still the one the audience should go with, if you will. All right, so you're going to be thinking about the opposition, working with your project along the way. If you have any questions about this PowerPoint, feel free to let me know.